We covered NREP, the National Registry of Effective Programs and Practices. Again, Google it, become familiar with it. You can click on, you can actually search if there is a particular treatment model you're looking for. There's a search engine on there as well. And it has more than 350 interventions listed there. And many of the interventions available are public domain, so you can often get access to some evidence-based manuals through there. If it's not, it will indicate how you contact someone to obtain a manual or obtain more information about how to purchase one. So I highly recommend you become very familiar with that website. The COSIG, Co-Occurring Disorders State Incentive Grants, this is a process that the TIP 42 covers. It was a nationwide process to improve identification and treatment of people who have co-occurring disorders. There is also the Co-Occurring Center for Excellence, which also ensures that this movement and this improvement of co-occurring disorder treatment. And back in 2002, there was a report to Congress that was provided through SAMHSA on the prevention and treatment of co-occurring substance use disorders and mental disorders. It included not only prevalence information, but also what was the status of the service array and the service challenges that were occurring back in 2002, and a 5-year plan that was in place to improve that. And quite honestly, we've come a long way, so the awareness and the ability to screen and assess for co-occurring disorders continues to improve, but it has improved significantly since the report was released. There's also the Co-Occurring Disorders Integrated Dual Disorder Treatment Implementation Resource Kit, or the IDDT toolkit. It contains information in it regarding 6 evidence-based practices that can be helpful for co-occurring disorders, including collaborative psychopharmacology. So how is this process of psychopharm working for individuals who have co-occurring disorders? Assertive community treatment, and specifically covering some of the integrated dual disorder treatment, ACT, the community-based process for more active treatment. Family psychoeducation, which involves bringing the family in and not only educating the family on serious mental illness, but providing support and ensuring that the family receives the help that they need, as well as the client or customer, in improving serious mental illness, often used for psychotic disorders, but has also been found to be effective with other disorders as well, like bipolar. Supported employment. So some of the models around how do we help individuals who have a co-occurring disorder get employed and maintain employment. This is a population for which employment poses some significant challenges. So having a process where someone is a coach and ensuring that that person has the skills that they need, the vocational skills and it could be something as simple as not only learning how to perform a particular job, but how do you get up and show up on time, and how do you use the transit system, and how do you make sure that what you're wearing is appropriate for a job site. So it can include an array of skills that someone who has a co-occurring disorder may need some help with. And also illness management and recovery and integrated dual disorder treatment are sections of the IDDT toolkit. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the definitions, terms, and classification systems. We've already covered some of the terminology already, so we won't go over that again. Let's review and discuss terms related to substance use disorders only, mental disorders, this client, consumer, member issue, treatment, programs, and systems. Here is a image I inserted for DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This was just released in 2013, so this is relatively new. There have been several changes that have been made to the DSM-5 that were not present in the DSM-4. If you do diagnosing, you'll want to ensure that you're very familiar with some of those changes. It is not as simple as doing a crosswalk, like this particular disorder or code equals this particular disorder or code. There were some criteria changes that you'll want to be aware of, and I may highlight just a couple that are relevant for this presentation, but you really want to make sure you're familiar with those if you diagnose. So the DSM-5, for those who don't do diagnosing, essentially it is the Bible, and here it is in real life. You'll see my little stickies when I do use it. It contains the criteria for diagnosing specific disorders that are behavioral health disorders. So it contains not only mental health issues, but substance use disorders, intellectual and developmental disabilities, and a full array of behavioral health conditions that someone may be experiencing. It's used by the medical and the mental health fields as a reference for diagnosing, and it provides us with a common language for communicating about disorders. What do we as a field consider to be a diagnosable disorder versus not? It also contains the ICD-10 diagnoses, which have a mandatory implementation date coming right around the corner. So in the DSM-5, it contains not only the ICD-9 code for each of the disorders, but also the ICD-10 code. Again, I want to emphasize that because I think that this is some area that as people are going through the ICD-9 to ICD-10 transition, they think they can just input a crosswalk. And that can help from a very simplistic IT perspective. But as a clinician and from a clinical perspective, it's very important to be aware that as the criteria changes, you can't just switch the numbers and assume that you have the appropriate diagnosis. Someone who had a diagnosis in ICD-9 or DSM-4 may not have the same diagnosis in ICD-10 or DSM-5. Now, that sounds pretty drastic, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case, so don't be alarmed, but it could be. So you just want to make sure that you're going back and referring to the criteria to make sure that it continues to be met. And some disorders that were in DSM-4 no longer exist in DSM-5, like Asperger's is not a diagnosis in DSM-5 anymore. It is part of the autism spectrum disorders. So, a couple of the changes that you'll notice is that DSM-5 eliminated this distinction between substance abuse and substance dependence. So where in DSM-4 you could diagnose someone with a substance abuse diagnosis, or you had to determine is it actually substance dependence, DSM-5 doesn't have that. So DSM-5, someone would be on a continuum or on a distinguishing range of a substance use disorder. So it's not substance abuse or substance dependence, it's substance use. So a few of the primary categories in DSM-5 include substance use, substance induced. So you'll still have those conditions that you'd need to distinguish are substance induced. It does have substance intoxication and substance withdrawal, and then this concept of unspecified substance-related disorders as well. Now, I wanted to include, I wasn't sure how many of you might have a background in mental health diagnosing and how many of you might have just substance use background. So I wanted to highlight some of the main primary categories for mental health issues as well, especially those that you might be encountering frequently. It is not uncommon for someone who does substance abuse treatment to encounter someone who has a personality disorder. There are 4 defining features of personality disorders. Those tend to include distorted thought patterns, problematic emotional responses, over or under-regulated impulse control, and interpersonal difficulties. As in the DSM-4, and then they kept it in the DSM-5, they have this concept of the three clusters in personality disorders. Cluster A is a cluster that contains individuals who have social awkwardness and social withdrawal. So you might see some odd or eccentric behavior. This includes the paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders. So these are individuals who are probably not hanging out in the community and hanging out with their friends. I mean, they tend to be relatively isolative and have some significant issues with engaging with others. Now, this does not mean that they have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So that's a separate diagnostic category. If someone has the full diagnostic criteria for a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, then they would not be diagnosed as a personality disorder as well. This is just individuals who are not psychotic, but they tend to have a difficult time in interacting with other people, and they have a social awkwardness component associated with their personality. Cluster B, this is the cluster that you may see most often in the hospital or if you're doing screening in the jail. You see a lot of impulse control, emotion regulation issues here. It involves dramatic, emotional, or erratic behavior. These personality disorders include antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. So you might see someone who is very emotionally labile. So at the hospital they may be very, very upset, threatening to hurt themselves, having a lot of significant issues associated with a breakup or a fear of abandonment. Or you may see criminal behavior and some of the impulse control behavior associated with antisocial personality disorder. Cluster C includes anxiety cluster. So this isn't an anxiety disorder, that's separate, but this is a personality disorder that tends to be relatively anxious and fearful. This includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorders. Okay. Psychotic disorders. Psychotic disorders tend to have delusions and hallucinations. When an individual has a psychotic disorder, this is often pretty indicative that they have what would be considered a serious and persistent mental illness. And then some of the types of schizophrenia include paranoid, disorganized, catatonic, undifferentiated, or residual. We'll talk a little bit about delusions. These are this is just a brief overview of what is a delusion, and we'll talk about what is a hallucination as well. A delusion is a fixed belief that is not amenable to change in the light of conflicting evidence. So if you are someone who treats individuals who have psychotic disorders, you are probably aware that it probably doesn't do a lot of good to try to convince them their delusion is a delusion. Individuals who have a lot of experience working with this population know that although you don't validate the delusion, you don't agree with it, you also don't spend a lot of time arguing with it, because these are individuals that you want to have a good therapeutic alliance with and ensure that they're doing what they need to do and they're staying out of trouble and that they're safe. And the best way to do that is often to not spend a lot of time arguing that their delusion is not accurate. Some of the different types include persecutory delusions, or belief that one is going to be harmed or harassed by an individual, organization, or group. Referential delusions, beliefs that certain gestures, comments, or cues are directed at oneself. So an example of this might be someone who is watching TV at night and believes that someone is sending them a specific message through the television set. Grandiose delusions, beliefs that he or she has exceptional beliefs, or exceptional abilities, wealth, and fame. Erotomanic delusions, individual who falsely believes another person's in love with him or her. You might see this on the news, someone who is stalking a news anchor person, because they believe that that person is in love with them, even though they may not have met. A nihilistic delusion, conviction that a major catastrophe will occur. So you might see individuals starting to set up a panic room and bringing in a lot of food and things like that because they believe that the end of the world is near. I mean, that might be indicative of a nihilistic delusion. And also a somatic delusion, this focus on preoccupation regarding health and organ function. There are several examples that could fit within some of these. Like, for instance, someone who believes that they're pregnant when they're not, and they have this preoccupation with a pregnancy that doesn't exist, could be a somatic delusion. Let's see. Okay. I do want to make a note, though, that when you're working with someone who has a delusion, it's important not to assume that it's a delusion. You want to get adequate information to understand what's going on, because it could very well be that the person has someone who's following them and they're interpreting it in a different way, but it's important to check it out.